Today we are looking at Blaise Pascal by Tomlin. It's a particularly interesting book, this one, because I picked it up expecting to do a just interesting history, albeit I had also heard about Pascal's wager being misunderstood, and there's a lot of that in this. It turned out, though, there's so much in this book that's interesting that I've managed to do a sort of a theological-based video on my other channel. And on here, there's still a ton of really interesting history. So we're doing that as well. So the first book I've ever read that I'm doing 2 reviews on. Pascal himself, anyway, I think most people have probably heard of. And he lived from 1623 to 1662, dying at age 39 of stomach cancer. And he had quite a sickly life in general, as it happens. But he was a bit of a weird guy. I mean, he was not very agreeable, not particularly pleasant in many ways, but a hugely dedicated Christian. And I guess some of the interest in that is the fact that he was one of the sort of founding fathers of science, as it were, but also profoundly theological and all the rest of it. So the interaction between those two sides of his personality, as it were, do make him particularly interesting. One of the problems I find with history, I find history fascinating now. Unfortunately, I didn't when I was at school, so all the stuff there I missed. But the big problem is there is just so much of it that you've got no hope of learning it all. So I've put together this thing with the help of ChatGPT to try and illustrate where Blaise Pascal sits in the big mix of all this history around this time. So you can see here at the bottom, Pascal, born 1623, died 1662, and all the bits above it are some of the other people who lived and some of the big events that surrounded his life and overlapped a lot of it. So we've got the Renaissance. Obviously, everyone's heard of the Renaissance, the whole art and all the rest of it. He toddled on basically towards the end of that, but it was part of the context in which he lived. And then the Reformation is key, and this is the bit where the Protestantism arose and split off from the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church did not like this at all. And this in turn laid the groundwork for the 30 Years' War, which I had heard of, but only from Red Dwarf. I didn't actually know when it was or where it was or what that was about. But it was 30 years long, obviously. But it was a massive thing, which loads of people died. And it was basically Catholics versus Protestants, which I know a lot of us have seen in our lifetimes in Northern Ireland. It's such a silly idea, though, isn't it? It's Christians versus Christians, and it just doesn't seem to make much sense. But thousands of people died in this thing across the whole of Europe. Also in the mix, though, we have the enlightenment, which came sort of shortly after Pascal, but it was bubbling along during his time, and he was one of sort of the early figures in that. Interesting, though, the enlightenment we associate with the rise of reason and the subjugation of religion and all that. So we were getting rational and reasonable as a species, so we're rising above religion sort of thing. So it's really interesting that Pascal sits in the middle of that, both as a theologian and a scientist. You may have heard Pascal is a measure of pressure, because Pascal himself did some of the very earliest experiments to work out that air is heavier at ground level than it is at altitude, therefore hence pressure. And this Catholic Protestant infighting, as it were, so is it infighting or outfighting, I don't know what you call it, but the fight between them is absolutely key for the context in which he lived his life. If we go back to the graphic, you can then see also all these other people who lived around this time. So Shakespeare had he just died, but only just before Pascal was born. Galileo was around doing his things during Pascal's life. He died whilst Pascal was around, but he was still there. Oliver Cromwell doing all his things with Charles I and all the rest of it, albeit Cromwell seemed to be a bit of a nutter. He was a Puritan, which are illustrated very nicely in the Blackadder series. Isaac Newton as well was around at the same time that Pascal was doing. I mean, he lived much longer than he did. But that was all going on at this time, and it was only 100 years before Pascal that Copernicus discovered that the Earth wasn't at the centre of the universe, sort of thing. Where the history gets really screwy, though, and I found this quite interesting, is that he also coincides with Louis XIV of France. And maybe from D'Artagnan, I don't know. But in my head, Louis XIV, actually also The Man in the Iron Mask, the Leonardo DiCaprio film, where Louis XIV is the young king and Cardinal Richelieu sort of manipulating him behind the scenes. Turns out that's all completely made up. Richelieu died the same year as Louis XIV's father died, so basically had nothing to do with him. And Queen Anne always seems to be portrayed in movies and the rest of it as quite a nice queen that everyone likes, but no, she wasn't very popular either. And it's an interesting idea that Hollywood just takes history, completely throws out the window, does something completely different, and realise the fact that none of us know what really happened. So, yeah, and they just make up history. I mean, it's worse than Dan Brown to some extent, isn't it? It does, though, seem that Pascal lived in this sort of temporal nexus point or something in history, like in the Back to the Future movies, where everything keeps going back to 1955 and it's like some really significant event, or could be a massive coincidence. And it did make me wonder, is every period in history like that? Because, I mean, there's so much goes on all the time that if you dig into any period in history, is it surrounded by lots of key events, or are there any sort of dead zones of history where nothing happens? I suppose maybe the Dark Ages is supposed to be that. But yeah, interesting idea. Some of the context for the Catholics versus the Protestants is really interesting, I find, actually, because the book talks about the resurgence of the Catholic Church in the late 1500s and early 1600s. I know I'm supposed to say 16th century and 17th century, but why would you do that? Why don't you just say 1500s and 1600s? It's just very odd. And it just seems to be this religious revival that seems to inspire the Catholics to push back really hard, because their identity is under threat. And it's a really interesting idea that we sort of see a bit of now to some extent. You know, when people feel threatened in their identity, they tend to sort of push back. And some of that seems to be happening today, actually, doesn't it? With the dissatisfaction with the secular view of the world. And it does seem to be driving, to some extent, an increase in interest in religious ideas. I know there's some debate on to what extent that's happening, but it does appear to be happening to some degree, at least. There's also talk of the first 40 years of the 1600s, the number of monasteries in France goes from 15 to 70. Like a really stark illustration of the idea that people are really trying to get to grips with this stuff. And basically looking for something that the standard Catholic life couldn't deliver, or something along those lines. There's a bit of a tangent. Pope Paul IV, who was dead before Pascal, quite a bit before Pascal, to be fair. But he, in part of his pushback against the Reformation, being the rise of Protestantism, he was going around burning a lot of books. And his idea was that believe heresy is an infectious disease spread by books. Can you imagine if he saw social media these days? It would be beside himself. And it's like, I mean, people do write silly books these days still, with some dumb ideas in. But yeah, nothing compared to social media. Anyway, Pascal's dad falls foul of Cardinal Richelieu, who it does seem was a baddie, so it sounds like the film's got that right. But then Pascal's sister does some drama performance for Richelieu and decides that seems to endear the family to him. So he gives Pascal's dad a job as a tax collector. Great, thanks. And partly in response to this, Pascal helps develop this thing called a Pascaline, which is a calculating machine, which is to help his dad calculate tax due. It turns out you can trace this basically in the lineage of the modern calculator. Another bizarre idea is that the calculator, as we think of it, was only invented in 1961. I suppose that should have been obvious, but for some reason I found that quite surprising. We then get into the interesting idea that Pascal is part of the Enlightenment, or the early part of the Enlightenment, where science is increasing. And apparently a lot of apologists of the day, that's people who defend faith and argue for it, were trying to use a scientific approach, I guess sensing the current of the time and just trying to get on board with that. And it notes that this managed to create lots of atheists by accident, so it didn't go very well. Pascal's idea, meanwhile, is that despite being clearly a very good scientist, that science wasn't holding the answers to religion. So you had science on the one hand, which didn't really satisfy. But then you get to know God through a sense of instinct, through the heart. The heart being, rather than a valve pumping blood, it being a sort of slightly more abstract idea of instinct, that sort of thing. Pascal was also friends with Descartes, the I think therefore I am guy, who was also a Christian and tried to prove that God exists through reason. But yeah, Pascal's feeling was just that, no, it's not science, it's not reason, you've got to do it through the instinct of the heart. And it's very interesting that one of the founding fathers of science saw no conflict between science and religion. You wonder if the world could learn a bit from that today. And it's worth briefly looking at what is the difference between the Catholics and the Protestants. It ain't much. But basically, the Protestants argue that you can only get to heaven through faith. So basically, you can't earn your way into heaven. And the Catholics were arguing, they set up the Council of Trent in the 1500s or something to try and sort of more clearly define Catholic doctrine in order to push back on the Protestantism. And they basically argued that you need that faith to get you there, but that's inseparable from good works. And they go to war over this for 30 years, and it's insane. You kind of think, well, they're probably both right to some extent, but they I certainly these days, I would see it as just different ways of expressing your faith, surely. I mean, there's some odd ideas bouncing around there, but not key pivotal ones. They all seem to agree on the basic points. But yeah, no, it's that ends up with a 30-year war because people are too stupid to figure out that was not a good idea. The book also talks about Pascal taking a trip for a couple of months with a religious man and a couple of far more secular people, and this sort of driving him away from the secular thing. And that's really interesting. There's a parallel for that in my life with my job, because I work in finance. When I got into that, some of the motivation was money and finance, and you're surrounded by a lot of very wealthy people having things. You think, oh, that's nice, I like that. And gradually over the years, I sort of got a growing distaste for it. And it's interesting that Pascal clearly felt that in a quite profound way and acted upon it. He was theoretically quite a wealthy man, but gave it all up and lived actually quite a humble existence, which I do not. But yeah, I kind of that's an interesting sort of timely thing in my life for something that's going on. And he also talked about an interesting theory that the soul is ultimately wants connection with God, but that human nature will tend to distract us with things that are right here in front of us, material things. I did a live event from the other channel the other week, and part of my reasoning for why I'm not a Christian, I said, the point is you're going along in life and there's all this stuff right in your face screaming at you that you have to deal with. So you deal with it because it's the thing that's shouting the loudest. And it seems that's very much something that Pascal was picking up on hundreds of years ago. We get an interesting side thing in Pascal is simultaneously reading Epictetus, the Stoic philosopher from yonks and yonks ago, and a chap Montaigne, who was a French philosopher writing all sorts of things. And they had sort of these quite different ideas. And Epictetus taught that humans, as Pascal felt, that they could be overconfident in how much they could know about God. And Montaigne, on the flip side, would talk about that basically nothing could be known for sure. So Pascal found him quite sort of corrosive in terms of just throwing scepticism on everything. But Pascal does quite a good job of reconciling the two, because he talks about they're both trying to get to the same thing, which is basically peace, well-being and happiness. But he was talking about the two different sort of instinctively opposing philosophies are actually, if you zoom out, make more sense. So that Epictetus sort of describes humanity's potential, as it were, whereas Montaigne sort of describes more the fallen reality. But if you think of it in terms of the Adam and Eve thing, and that humans were supposed to be doing one thing and actually got it all wrong, as it's difficult to argue with the fact that we did. They're both different perspectives on the same big picture, and it's really interesting how he manages to stitch those together and say they're actually both right, just from slightly different angles. And then part of the foundation of the Pensées, which is what Pascal's famous book that his writings that he wrote, was that sceptical people can learn from Epictetus and overconfident people can learn from Montaigne. So it's an interesting sort of levelling type idea. We then have the Jansenists versus the Jesuits, which is sort of interesting in the sense that from Man in the Iron Mask, Jeremy Irons talks about being the secret leader of the Order of Jesuits. And I'm like, okay, great, he seems nice, but is that a good thing? And so we talk a bit about the difference between the Jansenists and the Jesuits, who are both sort of factions of Christians, as it were. And the Jansenists talk about basically you almost have no say in it. God has to pick you to give you grace in order for you to be saved, which is a very sort of Calvinist idea that came out of the Reformation. And the Jesuits, I would say, quite rightly point out that that's just stupid, because then we're just pawns. We have no say in anything, so there's no responsibility if that were true. So, yeah, basically you could say that the Jesuits are sort of very casual about faith, and I don't think Pascal particularly liked that. And the Jansenists were really full on, but to an extent that it was basically not possible for most people to live with that, as it were. And I think Pascal seemed to be sort of caught in the middle, so it seemed to be suggested that he was a Jansenist, but he's sort of denied that to some extent. But he was critical of the church in sort of appeasing themselves to people, so to try and make religion easier, to try and mass market it or something, as it were. So I guess he leaned Jansenist in that respect, but it would seem to have been otherwise a bit more Jesuit. To the extent you have to be in a camp, obviously you don't. That's just crazy. Going back to the science bit, I say a lot of the apologists of the time trying to use science to prove it. Pascal's feeling was that everything from nothing, which is, I guess, is one of the key arguments for design, is that once upon a time there was nothing and then it exploded in the Big Bang. I was like, what? It doesn't make a lot of sense. Pascal says that this is creates too much to deny and too much to prove, and therefore inevitably agnosticism, but then tries to turn it into some sort of proof of a hidden God, in the sense that God would be hidden, therefore his hiddenness is evidence of his existence, which, to be fair, I mean, he's smarter than me, clearly, but that sounds like rubbish. Although he does, to be fair, say that God is hidden to those not willing and reveals himself to those who really look. But that has an overlay of delusion potential, I guess, which can be problematic, I think. We then have another bit that's relevant today, I think. Something called the Fronde, only with a French accent, obviously, which was a 5-year civil war in France where the people were disagreeing over the direction the government were taking. And, sounds a little bit like now. But to be fair, they had a 5-year war about it, and we're all arguing about it and grumpy with each other and getting more and more tribalised sort of thing. But at least we're doing better than the French at that point. And Pascal's feeling, he was very anti-Fronde, and his feeling was that all of this argument about it was more about vanity than about sort of establishing the glory of God, as it were. And he had this wonderful idea that I really like, that the majority opinion, he thinks, reflects the opinion of those who are least clever. So, yeah, I think that would be difficult to argue with. You get a lot of, towards the more extremes, a lot of it just seems to be very faulty in reasoning, doesn't it? That's what, like, even now. And there's some interesting bits that aren't quite quotes, but they're ideas from the book anyway. But there's this idea that politics is rules for the madhouse. You need it, but it's only ever a matter of keeping a lid on chaos. That's quite a good way of looking at it, isn't it? I mean, you can't not have leadership, but at the same time, there's no way that you're ever going to get a perfect solution. So it's always going to be compromised badly. And if you think of it by lowering the bar from rather than trying to get to sort of utopian perfection, lowering the bar just down to keeping a lid on chaos, seems like a great way of looking at that, I think. He also talks about he also talks about Pascal having the view that humanity is easily distracted by things that are ultimately not worthy of much attention. I guess see phones and social media, that sort of thing, and the amount of stuff people miss out on. It's a hilarious and somewhat tragic game. Go out for dinner and then look across the tables and see how many people are just sat there on their phones. It's just so bizarre. And talk about things not worthy of attention, and there you go. There's an interesting linguistic part as well, in that apparently there's an unprecedented increase in the number of words arriving in language that relate to the self. And you might think of that as, that sounds like that's sort of the growing selfishness. But actually, it seems it's more about the self in terms of a deprecating sort of way. And it's kind of close to that C.S. Lewis idea that you say if you're on the right track, you'll have a fairly low opinion of yourself. Which I must say, I'm not sure I agree with that. It's very uncomfortable disagreeing with Blaise Pascal and C.S. Lewis. But, there you go. You can only go with what you think. But yeah, the book talks about this whole thing being sort of actually foundational, going back 500 years or 400 years, whatever it is, being some of the groundwork that leads to the point we're in now, where this sort of me-centrism that we have today, where everyone wants to define the world by how they feel about it and all that sort of crazy, stupid stuff. I discovered the word, which I'm not quite sure how to say it, concupiscence, which is a wonderful word, which I've never heard of before, and I'm probably going to forget again. But it encompasses disordered human inclinations and urges that are contrary to reason. Yeah, sort of just stubbornly doing stuff that's blatantly wrong, I suppose. So, a reasonable summary of that. To finish off anyway, we've got 4 quotes this time. So the first one is, "The only thing that consoles us from our misery is diversion, and yet it is the greatest of our miseries." I really like that. I think you can see that in the rise of the smartphone. You can see in the stats all the anxiety and depression that's followed as a result of that. And it would seem to be the ultimate misery at the minute. And it's self-inflicted and people just want to play with it. Next, and along similar lines, he says, "Nothing could be more wretched than to be intolerably depressed as soon as one is reduced to introspection with no means of diversion." Which I guess is the flip side to that, isn't it? So if you're sitting down doing nothing, you can't help but get your phone out. And he's suggesting that's basically to avoid sitting there alone with your thoughts. And it's, 400 years later, and he's kind of nailed it, hasn't he? We then have the sole cause of man's unhappiness is that he does not know how to sit quietly in his room. So, yeah, okay, I guess that's probably the same idea. But he's good at putting these, obviously he'd have put them in French, wouldn't he? But he's a smart guy, clearly, both philosophically and scientifically. And finally, we have the immorality of the soul is something of such importance to us, affecting us so deeply that one must have lost all feeling not to care about knowing the facts of the matter. I really like that because that's sort of tying into my other channel where I'm reading the Bible and trying to work out if this stuff is true. And it didn't occur to me at all, but prior to doing that maybe that would be a good idea. But yeah, you finally get to the point where you're going, oh yeah, okay, actually this might be important. Perhaps I should go and work this out. So that's one that sort of speaks very well to me. Anyway, fantastically interesting, really well written, worth a go. Kind of light reading as well. There's a lot in it, but it's easy to read. So yeah, definitely worth a go.